Hello and welcome to Pop Screen, part of the Geek Show podcast network. We are that corner of the Geek Show that likes to talk about the good, the bad and the tricky of movies, either starring, about or by pop stars. The podcast covers such a broad range of musical and cinematic genres, from country and western to hip-hop, from documentaries to science fiction. I'm your host, Graham Williamson. I'm a writer for the Geek Show, Byline Times, We Are Cult and Horrified, the British horror website. And I've been joined this week by...
Hi, I'm Jeff Pizak. I am not a professional movie writer, but I'm a longtime movie fan. You can find me on Letterboxd at Scrambled Face.
This was a film I was really excited to find out that you were interested in, because I'd been fascinated by it for a long time. I think it's not as if there's a shortage of movies with rappers in, but there may be a shortage of movies that have something interesting to say about hip hop. Mostly they tend to be like cameos in straight to video horror movies, not naming any names, Snoop Dogg. But yes, this is Tougher Than Leather, which is the Run-DMC movie directed by their manager Rick Rubin, and also featuring a very notable cameos from Slick Rick and the Beastie Boys. It's the first time I'd seen this, but you've got priors with this, right, Jeff?
I sure do, yeah. So as a young kid growing up in the U.S., I was, of course, enamored with Run-DMC when they came out. I didn't hear them till, of course, the Walk This Way cover exploded in the top 40, and it was one of those really strong musical draws for me. So by the time their movie came out, I had not seen, and we may talk about this later, Crush Groove, which they had been in prior, was sort of the early run for the story of Def Jam Records. But I did have that soundtrack, and I, of course, was a big fan of the Beastie Boys as well. So all that is to say, when Tougher Than Leather came out in not many theaters, from what I remember, but I did make a point to go see it. And, just to get this story out of the way, I actually, as I was maybe 12, I think, 13 maybe when it came out, and had to talk the guy at the ticket booth into letting my friend and myself in because it was an R-rated movie. I had never had any trouble getting into. At that time I wasn't going to a lot of R adult type movies, but this one definitely I had to do some sweet talking. And if I remember correctly, my argument was, well, it's a Run-DMC movie, so how many old people do you think are actually going to come see this? And eventually, yeah, he let us in. So it was actually one of my first, R-rated adult type pictures that I saw in the theater without any adults with me.
Nice. So that you mentioned being into Run-DMC, and you mentioned being into the Beastie Boys. So this would have been around the time it came out, right? That 87, 88?
Yeah, it says 88 on the film. My memory says it came out earlier, but I'm guessing not.
I think it's one of those things, but I've seen both dates, so yeah, who knows? I am not surprised that you said that it didn't show in many screens, despite having these two massive bands in. Because one of the other major hip hop films we've done for Pop Screen, me and Rob did a Patreon episode about Belly, and that was, though now a cult classic, was blackballed from a lot of cinema chains for fears that there would be copycat gang violence, which is one of those I don't know if has there ever been a film where there's been like gangsters coming out of it shooting at each other in the foyer. I feel like this has never happened, but it's an omnipresent fear every time one of these is released.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm trying to think of a more recent one. I remember that being Belly. I remember Set It Off having that kind of a concern when it came out with Queen Latifah. I
There was one in Britain recently, a film called Blue Story, directed by Rapman, a British hip hop artist, where there was apparently quite a violent fight in the foyer of some cinema when it came out, and it got pulled from Odeon. I think it was Odeon theatres. What the stories didn't mention is that the fight occurred among people who'd just come out of Frozen 2, which made for a slightly less gangster story, I think.
right, right, yeah. I was gonna say. I mean, at least this one has some crime and violence actually in the story. So,
Yeah,
but yeah, that's wild.
and it's quite an odd thing too because this is very early on in the cycle of gangster narratives in hip hop. I mean, there had been hip hop records about crime and poverty before. Run-DMC had recorded quite a lot of them, but this film really centers its appeal on it being basically a black exploitation movie where people rap. That would go on to be massive in about 4 or 5 years' time, but I can't think of an earlier example of it than this.
No, I can't either. And I think it's telling that that those elements are there and that they're driving the story. But the stars are kind of peripheral to that world.
Hmm.
Um, they're at least the Run DMC being the stars. Their managers are corrupt and involved in these dealings, and but they themselves are really only reacting to that environment. They're already established as popular musicians when the story starts.
Well, yeah, even though it starts with that very protracted and kind of cool, actually, sequence of is it DMC coming out of prison at the start,
Yes.
which is I think a better directed scene than most of what follows. It's got It reminded me weirdly of the opening scene of the Blues Brothers, which I
Yes.
recently did for our sister podcast, Directors Uncut.
Yep. Yeah. I've always thought the same thing. It definitely has.
Mm,
And the Blues Brothers being a Chicago classic, so it's a local favorite here. But yeah, that whole opening where DMC comes out and gets his stuff back, and so they're introducing him through his artifacts, his hat, his
yeah,
rings, all the stuff, and so and then they finally reveal that it's him. Yeah, it is a great shot.
it's
That
it's a great opener, but I think it sets you up for like him and the rest of the band being, as you say, less peripheral to the crime story than they are. But I think there's a kind of honesty in that in a strange way because I was thinking about Run DMC's position in hip hop as I watched this, and their music for its when they started out was like radically tougher and more authentic than anything that had appeared in hip hop before. They didn't have that disco influence or that electro pop influence that people like Sugar Hill Gang or Grandmaster Flash did. It was just stark, stripped back beats and rhymes, often about the difficulties of living life in a poor area. And by the late 80s, this is sort of starting to fork off into two paths, isn't it? Where there still is that kind of tough, minimalist rap music around, but it's tending towards this more nihilistic world of what would become gangster rap, while there is also still hip hop that is socially conscious and about social issues, but it doesn't sound much like Run DMC. It sounds like Diggable Planets or a Tribe Called Quest. So they are like standing It's like the old comedy bit with the guy standing on two canoes and having them slowly drift apart as they do the splits. Run DMC are really kind of paying for being such pioneers by being split between two hip hop movements that are indebted to them, but are also kind of different to them.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation because I think that this, I mean, 88 being that really key moment in hip hop. You're right. Yeah, they were straddling those two kind of camps, having that more social conscience as well as the tougher, more boastful kind of, we're the kings of rock,
Yeah,
that kind of approach. And I think that after this point, that's where Run DMC really, I mean, again, we might get into this later, but I think that's where they really started to struggle commercially because there wasn't quite the space for them. There
mm,
wasn't, I mean, obviously, hip hop loves to pay tribute to the old school, but a lot of the old school artists don't tend to have that commercial long run. And I
yeah.
think that not long after than Tougher Than Leather is when that really started for DMC. Their records after this were kind of floundering to find a new approach or a new a fresh way to do what they were doing in the 80s.
Yeah, I think that lack of nostalgia in hip hop, that determination to keep pushing forward, that's made the genre like the most vital form of music right now, has also been bad news for a lot of its pioneers. And Run DMC certainly are among the crowd of people who did something that absolutely changed the genre, that modern hip hop would be unrecognizable without. But once their commercial moment in the sun had passed, they were pushed aside quite cruelly. But watching this, I sort of thought that if that's the fork in the road, if that's the choice, becoming a more gangster band or becoming a more conscious band, they probably made the right choice. I mean, it's slightly artificial, but it's rooted in what they did before, and it makes more sense than them just, turning up at the studio with an armful of Miles Davis records and being like, "All right, we're a Tribe Called Quest now." That would have been really that would not have worked at all, I think.
Sure. Yeah. No. Yeah. The record after this one, Back from Hell, is kind of a lost one, but the one after that, Down with the King, if I remember correctly, they had like Onyx and people like that as their guests. So again, trying to push that. We're still tough. We're the originators, but we're current, and we've got these ruffians with us as opposed to Q-Tip or somebody like that.
Yeah. Hey, speaking of ruffians, the Beastie Boys in this film,
Yeah, and speaking of Q-Tip, he guested with them later when they got
of
a little more touchy
course.
feely. Yeah,
Yeah. Um, yeah, what a very strange thing, because I've been going through a massive Beastie Boys phase recently. I just have moments where I really dive back into the Beastie Boys, and I've enjoyed listening back to their catalogue so much. But this is very early Beastie Boys, and they're sort of, it's weird because the film wants you to take them quite seriously. It wants you to believe they're quite scary, but they're also definitely the comic relief in this story.
yeah. They of all the other Def Jam guests and stars that we have roles or cameos in here, they definitely have the most screen time,
Hmm.
and it's that License to Ill era, early party hardy kind of vibe that they're still kind of pushing. That I think even by this time they were starting to transition out of. But yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting how they're kind of the chaos factor. They show up in
Hmm.
scenes. There's that long scene where Ad Rock is hitting on the secretary at the office, and it like a lot of the early parts of the movie. It's just kind of slice of life, feels almost improvisational. But yeah, they're definitely the comedy factor as opposed to our main stars.
But also, there's the scene later on in the restaurant,
Mhm.
which ends with the sort of racist maitre d'
Mhm.
exclaiming in shock that the white ones were even worse, and that's like that gets kind of closer to the appeal of the Beastie Boys as they were then. I mean, it's very easy now to watch Ad Rock play, the guy with the arm full of cheesy chat up lines who gets knocked back time and time again because it fits with our understanding that the Beastie Boys license to ill persona was just a big joke, and you watch that and you think, oh yeah, I can see it. But there's also this aspect where I recently read Beastie Boys book, the thing that uh, Adam Horowitz and Mike Diamond put together a few years back. And that's got guest chapters by all sorts of people. Andre Leon Talley, Wes Anderson's in there, just a really eclectic mix. Colson Whitehead. Um, but there's a piece by Jonathan Lethem which says that in a strange way, License to Ill was the launch pad for gangster rap, even though it isn't about gangster narratives and it doesn't sound like gangster rap. The success of that album is what sort of put the light bulb on and thought, oh, rap music can make a lot of money if it scares suburban parents.
Sure. Yeah,
Mm,
no, that definitely makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I see a straight line from that early Beastie Boys to say early Eminem, and I'm not just
mm,
culturally, but like that first Eminem album is all about what a bad influence he is, what how you don't want your kids to be listening to him, and of course that's the appeal for suburban kids, to get that hooked. Of course, you want to listen to something that's going to piss off your parents. So, yeah, they
yeah.
definitely filled that role. Whereas someone like Run DMC, Slick Rick, these guys were not even pushing any sort of angle. They were who they were, so to
It's
speak.
quite funny because you could definitely market Slick Rick as a guy who was going to scare your parents, but I guess at that stage, the idea that suburban white teenagers are going to be listening to Slick Rick was just off in space somewhere. No one was thinking about that.
Right. Yeah, yeah. It's interesting to see those personas play out. I mean, I would, I don't know for sure because again, I was kind of a child at the time when this came out. But looking back, I'm shocked at how small a role Slick Rick played in here. Um,
Yeah.
he shows up to do one song. I wrote down a note: is he only opening one of the tour dates? Because we only see him for one short period of time. But like in my mind, he's definitely a legend of hip hop who like in the grand scheme of things would have a larger place in something that was supposed to represent the culture.
Yeah, definitely. And it's that issue of is it supposed to represent the culture that is so fascinating because again, I guess like a lot of the original black exploitation films, this is black street culture and crime in the ghetto refracted through the directorial vision of someone who is white. And, someone who is white and is deeply involved in the scene, as Rick Rubin is, but that's still the contradiction of the film, right?
Oh, for sure, yeah. Even I was talking to my wife after we watched it, and I mentioned that uh, when I was a kid, I wasn't quite sure who was playing themselves and who wasn't. The Run DMC, the three guys in the group are all playing characters named after themselves, but is this their reality? I was the Beastie Boys, but Rick Rubin is in there, but he's playing a character. Russell Simmons is there, but he's playing himself. Um, and then the character of Runny Ray, their friend who becomes their roadie and whose murder kind of drives the crime plot. Um, as a kid, I always thought that he was just some guy who was part of their entourage, and then came to find out, no, he was an actor. I think it looks like he was sort of involved in the scene in general, but, um, he wasn't playing himself. So again, there's that kind of blurring of the line between a portrait and a sort of the fictional aspect of it.
Yeah, definitely. And there were people hanging around in their scene who were professional actors. I mean, one of the oddest things I discovered researching the production of this film is that around the time this was made, Eddie Murphy was best friends with Run-DMC and would often come down to the set, hang out. And I think the fact that Eddie Murphy isn't in the film is presumably down to Rubin's desire to reflect some sort of, authenticity in the film to make it a portrait of the scene rather than just a movie with stars. But I have to say, if I had like one of the biggest box office draws in the world right now hanging out on my set, I would probably have turned the camera on him at some point.
Sure. Yeah. No, that would have made sense. But yeah, you're right. It in this world, even though we're supposed to believe that Run DMC are these big stars, um, the it plays a little fast and loose with how that is portrayed. I was going to
Mm.
say when we see them, they're on a concert tour, they're performing in these spaces that look really small, and we don't often see the
They
audience.
do.
So I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, probably a budgetary thing where they were just kind of shooting in one space, but yeah, it's interesting because we know at this time, and they were playing stadiums.
Mm.
My cousin saw them on the Raising Hell tour, which was before this, and yeah, it was in a stadium. I mean, he told these stories about it. So it's really interesting to see that kind of we know they're big stars. We know everybody knows who they are, but also the depiction isn't it isn't puffed up in any way.
And I kind of like that. I think I like that they are playing these pokey little clubs, even though it stretches credulity, because presumably every single person who has ever watched this film is a Run DMC fan, and they know that this is post Walk This Way. This is when they were playing stadiums. But I think that there's something about the size of the venues they're playing here that makes it plausible for a rap band where like their lead MC's just got out of prison, they're in bed with these weird shady gangsters. It does, although I don't think verisimilitude is in that sort of cinematic sense is the main preoccupation of the film, it does help in a weird way.
Sure, yeah, and it keeps that kind of gritty street level kind of vibe, even though we know that it's a sort of a fantasy. So yeah, I think that makes sense.
Well, you can see that it's a fantasy in the scenes with Rick Rubin as Vic, who's like the main villain of this film. And Vic is the point where the film is sort of at its worst, but also at its most fascinating, which is just something that sometimes happens with pop movies. Because you do look at Vic and you think, what demons is Rick Rubin working out here? To make this film celebrating the scene that he has, nurtured so much and the label that he co-founded and the artists that he's turned into international megastars. And his role is the awful, racist, murderous white guy.
Yeah, and as a co-writer, he gave himself some really choice dialogue, so it wasn't. I mean, it was a deliberate choice, So
Mm.
yeah, yeah, I want to say him and the other guy who plays Arthur, the guy
Oh,
with the beard.
Rick Manello.
Grinello, yeah, I was gonna say he is also was sort of involved in the scene. I know he directed the "Fight for Your Right" video, but those two guys co-wrote this, and so again, probably had some sort of hand in the scene, the two of them, and yet the characters they gave themselves were these kind of sleazy, shady, and definitely not racially supportive. Both in like the words they have and their attitudes they project. So I mean, yeah, it could be that they were trying to kind of critique that approach, or it could be that they were, just kind of drawing on that black exploitation tradition where the villains are some white racist authority figures who are, taking advantage of our heroes.
That's a fair point. Yeah, I'm sure that, Manello is mentioned a lot in the Beastie Boys book.
Hmm.
He's mentioned as a guy who was just obsessed with films and had an encyclopedic knowledge of films. And anytime Def Jam needed to do anything regarding films, he was the guy that they turned to. So yeah, I'm sure he at least is capable of looking at the black exploitation formula and thinking, all right, what's the rules for white guys here? And that's one big one. But he's kind of an interesting guy. When he came on, I had to get over my unease at first because I thought he was James Tollback, but once I realised that he wasn't, I decided to check what else he's done. Do you know what he did? Who he's been working with in recent years?
No,
James Gray.
really.
Yeah, he co-wrote Two Lovers and The
Hmm.
Immigrant.
Interesting.
What a wild leap!
Yeah, yeah. I didn't even I didn't look him up that far, but yeah, that's interesting that he's kind of parlayed into a very different kind of cultural context for sure.
But it makes a certain sense when you think about it. I mean, if he is the guy who's sort of the genre technician on this movie, Gray's asset is that he is, very steeped in classic Hollywood genre, and he can take something like The Immigrant, which in someone else's hands is just a social realist film, right? And he can find the Vincent Minnelli or whoever his influences might be in it. So, yeah, I think they probably hit it off.
Sure. Yeah. No, I guess that makes sense. As a film fan, for sure.
But yeah, the crime plot is sort of interesting, it's interesting in a way that I think uh, gangster rap never really gets past, where it wants to decry this attitude that hip hop has something to do with criminality and also really milk the fuck out of how sexy and exciting that connection is at the same time. The best bit is when, again, I've completely forgotten which member of Run-DMC it is, but it could be DMC again. He's watching a white newsreader pontificate about the link between rap, crack, and violence, and he just kicks the TV over like Travis Bickle. And
Yep.
that's a very clear moral statement on that kind of panic around hip hop. And then it's back to a plot about rap, crack, and violence.
Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah. I remember when I first saw the movie that being a thing. I was, again, a kid who was attracted to all the bands I was told not to listen to, because they were going to rot my brain. And I was a pretty good kid, quote unquote. So
Mm.
it never really made sense to me. And that that whole listening to something, or being involved in the culture will lead you down the path of moral ruin or whatever. But yeah, I remember that. I remembered that scene all these years later. I think I'd only seen the movie maybe once since that first time, until I
Mm.
just watched it. And yeah, that scene stuck with me because it really it speaks to the attitude at the time that was already starting to turn against hip hop as a cultural force because it had become so big so fast. I think.
And it's funny, isn't it? We should have a little pit stop and describe the sort of strange experience of being, uh, extremely white hip hop fans in the late 80s and 90s, because certainly by the time I was growing up, it was a much bigger cultural force in terms of records sold, in terms of concert tickets sold, in terms of, what was vital and new that you had to listen to. And yet there were still probably people who would not hear about any hip hop artists if it wasn't for the occasional news reports about one of them being shot. So it was quite a fraught thing. I mean, the only person on British mainstream radio, like without going out to the pirate stations, the only person on British mainstream radio who was playing hip hop consistently was Tim Westwood. And I mean, if we're talking about a white guy who was vampirically taken from the culture, he has recently been revealed as one of the ultimate examples of that. So it's quite weird to look back on the 90s as a time which a lot of people would cite as a golden age of hip hop and say, oh, that's when you had Nas, it's when Jay-Z was starting out, you had Tupac, NWA, Biggie, the Fugees, and then think, well, unless it was the Fugees getting to number one with a Roberta Flack cover, the main place that you could listen to hip hop in Britain was like if you were willing to put up with this pervy bishop's son
Mhm.
going, yo, 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 this is fresh in between the records. It's unbelievable that such a vital scene would be treated like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, looking back from the U.S. perspective, it was there were certain hits that were, and the ones you would know, I'm sure, that were just kind of integrated with the pop and top 40 culture at the time. The late 80s, early 90s, I think, were the last time we really saw that diversity in just our general. You could turn on a general radio station, and you would hear hip hop, you would hear, maybe a folk song, some really manufactured pop, something a little edgier. Hair metal was big at the time. Again, more commercial type stuff, but it would all be sort of a blend. So I think that if you wanted to specifically look for hip hop and stuff that wasn't part of that mainstream push, your DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince, or Young MC comes to mind. Some
Mm.
people, some of them were kind of one hit wonders. But that stuff was generally kind of selected and chosen for the pop audience. If you wanted to go deeper than that, you either had to know someone who was involved in the culture, or turn to maybe college radio, where the DJs were being, sort of like a pirate station, where people were a little more um, less regulated by what's going to sell, and more in terms of, this is music I like. So
Yeah,
that was really it. But there was some representation, but it was very uh, gate kept, for lack of a better term.
I think probably the fact that there wasn't anything resembling like indigenous British hip hop scene probably kept it from being you know, from penetrating as deeply as it could have in the UK back then. It was still subject to that kind of attitude where people are like, oh, it's just like Americans talking about drive-bys. What does that say about my life? And you think, well, you know, nobody talks like this about blues music, do they? I'm not living in the Mississippi Delta in the 1930s, but no one looks at me weird when I listen to Mississippi John Hurt.
Right.
it's it,
Yeah,
it, it
maybe it was just specifically the modern context. Maybe
yeah.
it was the fact that this is representing the here and now. If it is so geographically specific, then I can see where it might not resonate, unless you're willing to look past that and say, okay, there are themes here, there are things people talking about that are universal.
Oh, it's just that old thing, I think, where people, as soon as a battle over something, particularly something in the arts, is fought and won, everyone pretends that they were on the right side from the very start until something new comes out, and then everyone makes the exact same mistake all over again. And that was certainly happening with hip hop at that point. It wasn't really until the early 21st century that there was a recognizable kind of sustainable British hip hop scene. But also, who cares? Like nowadays, when I listen to, you know, Kendrick Lamar talking about bereavement, or Megan the Stallion talking about, growing up in a working class environment. I'm not like, holy shit, what's this about? I understand that. It's
Right.
not, it's just, yeah, it's so patronizing to say that just because occasionally they name check Compton, that I'm just supposed to be sat here going, what the hell is this about? You know?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think audiences get smarter too.
Yeah,
Kids understand. As a kid, I understood the difference between showing violence and creating violence. For example, for
yeah,
this movie, I think that the gatekeepers, the cultural gatekeepers, they try to predict what the reaction will be, and you never know. So I mean, in that sense, I think just music culture in general has gotten better because of the silos, because we know who we can trust and go to in terms of um, you know rep- rec- recommending something new, and then um, having the perspective to understand how it can apply versus just something you listen to. Like people come bring their expectations and their filters to anything they enjoy, and we have a lot of information at our fingertips. If we don't know what the slang is or where Compton is, Google it. It's easy enough nowadays. So
and it's also part of the appeal, isn't it, that when you have these very specific bits of slang, again, that was another very boring thing that very boring people used to say in Britain about hip hop. It's like, oh, all this for shizzle manizzle, what does that mean? And it's like, well, what does a what bopalooba or what bamboo mean? Anytime there's a new scene, part of the appeal of it is that it has this coded language that's just for you, the initiates, to appreciate.
yeah, and yeah, absolutely. And I think that may be where people still get alienated from hip hop specifically,
Mm,
because the culture changes, the language changes, the slang changes. By the time it catches up with the general public, it's the song's been out for 6 months, and is has kind of trickled out. So I think that people, maybe people, older people, and myself maybe included, get a little intimidated by how much do I need to keep up with what they're talking about, and the answer is not much. You can usually figure out from context, or if not,
yeah,
there's so much going on. You don't have to focus on understanding lyrics immediately. It's one of those things that 6 months later you say, oh, that's what so and so was talking about in that song, and now I've seen it play out somewhere else. So yeah, that's I think that's going to always be an issue with something that is as tied into language and how it changes as hip hop is.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I like what you said about being, when you're a fan, you're able um, to understand the parts of it that are kind of play acting and that are kind of not to be taken too seriously. And you can sort of separate that from the underlying attitudes. It does remind me of something that Mark Kermode always says about the Evil Dead, which is that the original Evil Dead was controversial. He says because if you were a horror fan, you saw it and you found the excess so liberating, so funny, so cathartic, so outrageous. Whereas if you're not a horror movie fan, you watch it and it's just people getting ripped to pieces for 80 minutes.
Mm.
And I think there's something similar here. I think Tougher Than Leather is most, for whatever attitude Rubin and Manello went into it with, it is most endearing as people play acting something that is real to them, that is not false, but doing it in this kind of burlesque way that's quite cathartic.
Sure. Yeah. No, I was thinking of the example of the stock music that they use anytime anything sensual or sexual comes up. They bust out the stripper, which
Yes.
the ultimate symbol of sensuality in 1988. It's like, I mean, it's a shorthand, and you get what they're talking about. But like, is that something that's I think a modern audience like? Did they know the stripper? Would they understand that that's supposed to be what that's supposed to represent. Those shorthands, they're always changing, and even by, this time, I mean, I don't know if that felt really old fashioned at the time, but it definitely does now.
Oh yeah, I'd like to think it does, and I think some of those signifiers are interesting because they outlive their cultural moment. It feels like only in the last 5 years have we seen an end to comedies where every time that something shocking happens, there's a record scratch
Mm,
sound effect.
yeah.
I think that has comfortably outlived vinyl status as the biggest selling music medium, but it's still something about that sound just says, huh? Yeah,
Hmm.
it just
Hmm.
communicates it somehow.
Yeah, and people can pick that up from context.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's again the sort of density of the cultural referencing in a very different way this time. Yeah. There was an interesting cut to this in the UK. The version I managed to get hold of was uncut because it did have this thing. It played uncut at theatres, but around this time, the BBFC were very paranoid about the idea that you could take a movie home on video and just replay the violence and brainwash yourself with it. So
Mhm.
you often had this weird situation where something that was perfectly fine for cinemas would receive some quite arbitrary cuts. Um, on the home market. And the UK VHS release didn't have the scene of the guy being interrogated by having his fingers broken,
Hmm.
which I think is kind of interesting. Out of all of the violence, it's like that's the bit where maybe you squirm a bit. That's the bit which feels a bit less like play acting. I don't think it should have been cut, obviously, but I think the BBFC were kind of weirdly astute in recognizing that, oh, that seems kind of outside of the kind of cartoon universe that the rest of the film takes place in.
Yeah, and that's another scene that always stuck with me when I would think back to this and that happened. And I, I don't I don't disagree that it does feel more extreme. In the grand scheme of the movie, it doesn't. It's not excessively violent. You don't get these gnarly close-ups of the
Mm,
prosthetic fingers breaking and all that. But it does seem a little out of character for our, again, our heroes who are tough but not, and I guess looking not to kill anyone. But yeah, it does feel a little more extreme. But yeah, I am 100% anti-censorship, so
no,
I can't,
absolutely.
yeah, I can't abide that. But it does make sense knowing what I know about the BBFC at the time.
Yeah, I guess maybe one of the other things that sort of shocked people about that is that we are talking about a pre-24, pre-Jack Bauer kind of media landscape where you didn't have shows and films where the hero just tortures anyone every time they need like 50 pence to go to the shops with. Right, get the waterboarding kit out.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, again, it kind of plays like a Mike Hammer. He's just like a
Mm,
rough and tumble guy, and he's going to get the information no matter what. And so that's just what they did. But yeah, I don't think it's that extreme.
no, no. I suppose it is also probably a victim of that kind of moral panic that we were talking about. The violence in films, that's one thing, but violence in films aimed at a hip hop audience is, as we saw with Blue Story, still something that happens. And it's interesting that this was almost directed with someone who had the very same moral panic turned on them just a couple of years later, because Rick Rubin's first choice was that this should be directed by Spike Lee
Yeah, I had read that. That was new information to me. Yeah, really interesting. And he turned it down.
to do the right thing, which, fair play. He did, in fact, do the right thing there, but it's interesting to imagine what a Def Jam movie made in the late 80s would have been like with a young Spike Lee behind the camera.
Oh yeah, I mean, just I think visually, the energy, I think a whole lot more. I think it would feel a lot less low budget. I think Spike Lee did
Mm, mm.
turn those limitations into strengths, and the vitality of his films at the time definitely comes from not having that slick and more of those slice of life neighborhood moments. I want to say one of the guys in this was in Do the Right Thing. The one of the mob guys I
Oh,
recognized.
right.
Um,
I'm
I,
gonna have to look that up.
yeah, I don't remember
Um,
which one, but yeah, it was. So yeah, it makes sense. And again, it was around the same time that in New York that it was happening. But it would be super interesting to see Spike Lee's Tougher Than Leather. I would love to see that.
yeah, and credit where credit's due. Rubin got on that train early. I think Spike Lee would only have made She's Gotta Have It by
Mm,
this point. I don't think he'd even done School Days or anything like that. So
right.
he was, he could have been, had he stuck at it, as good a talent spotter in movies as he was in music.
Yeah. Yeah. If I don't think Rick Rubin really directed anything other than this. Um, so
No.
yeah, it is fun to see all the other references he sticks into his other groups there. I mean, other than the Beastie Boys, it open and actually the scene you mentioned where it opens with that first person shot, the point of view shot. We hear Flavor Flav doing
Hmm.
some riff over it as he's one of the other um, guys in the jail. I was gonna say later on we see there's a Slayer poster in the office, like another early Def Jam band.
I
Uh,
did not know that.
yeah,
Ha!
yeah, yeah. Um, and I mean, there was Public Enemy sampled Slayer, and that was one of those cross company collaborations that happened. I think in '88 as well, is when "It Takes a Nation of Millions" came out.
Ha!
And then also, one last thing, just as long as I'm talking about it, there's a scene where Ruben is sitting in his office listening to Danzig. And that first album was also, I mean, he was involved with Danzig early on, but that was another Def American maybe at that point, or maybe Def Jam still released. So he was kind of cramming in a little bit of all of that along with that Junkyard band that I had to look up. There was a band we see performing earlier on in the movie that's got some little kids in
Yeah.
it, and they were apparently out of Washington D.C. and are still going today. But I never thought about them after I watched this movie and just that. But they were another Def Jam band.
That's one of the beautiful things about these kind of package deal pop
Hmm.
movies, though, isn't it? That you'll get like one or two absolute megastars, you'll get a few people who are cult artists, maybe someone on their way up who'd become big later, and then a few people who are just happy to be invited.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, it's an interesting portrait of that pre Jay Z era of Def Jam, and it was sort of coming together at that time. They, like I said, they had heavy metal artists, they had hip hop, they hadn't really branched into like pop R&B yet, but that was coming as well. So, but yeah, I find that stuff really interesting too, and that um, it's a portrait of what was going on at the time.
No, definitely. Anything else to observe before we close up?
Well, the only other thing that I would call out, I mean, other than the fact that this has never been released on DVD to my knowledge, so
Very
um,
strange
or
that,
if
yeah.
or if it was an early one that's out of print. So, but yeah, it's strange that this movie isn't out there very easily to find. It's not streaming anywhere. And just a personal note would be the other thing I'd note would be the lady who plays the girlfriend of Rick Rubin's character, Lois Ayres, was an adult star, and she actually starred in the very first hardcore film I ever saw in my life called Virgin Heat. So I've always had a soft spot for Lois Ayres. So Um, and she has kind of a cool role in here. Actually, she helps them with their revenge plot. So I just wanted to
Is
shout her out.
is it one of the adult titles that's been added to Letterboxd? Because obviously my viewing experiences are now entirely built around whether I can write about something on Letterboxd.
Same here, to be honest. But yeah, I don't know. I didn't actually look that up, but I don't know that it's that famous of a film, so I wouldn't be surprised if it's not there. I just, recognize her and honor her for her contributions.
Shout out to Jenny Lamette, actually, while we're
Oh
talking about
yeah,
the film's female cast, because she plays the main female role in this. The daughter of Sidney Lumet, the granddaughter of Lena Horne, and would go on to write Rachel Getting Married for Jonathan Demme, which is pretty cool.
yeah. I noticed that she has some really interesting credits. I think she's still producing, the Paramount Plus Picard show. She had
Right.
some credit on there. So yeah, she's still working too, and but not in front of the camera.
Mm. Well, if you enjoyed that, we've got a Patreon open at www.patreon.com/The Geek Show, where you get Rob's reviews of Asian films that still need UK distribution. You get my Doctor Who reviews, and you get a bonus episode of this show every month, among other things. If you subscribe to our Patreon, you'll already have heard Mark tormenting me with the British football hooligan film The Governors. That's been an experience. Um, but we'll be back in a couple of weeks' time with our next free episode of Pop Screen. Until then, I've been Graham,
And I've been Jeff.
and we'll see you later.